Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is order, chaos, and change. So, chaos in varying degrees is a requirement for change. In other words, things need to be disrupted before they can find a new order. So, we're going to talk about how we can embrace the chaos and further our growth and evolution. So good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you joining us this morning, and welcome to everybody else who's with us. Before we get started with today's topic, let's take a minute or two to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And let's, as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together, vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, order, chaos, and change. So the resistance to change comes from, I think, the, maybe from inertia, or maybe even instead of inertia, maybe momentum, like things are going in one direction. In order to change things, that momentum needs to be disrupted, and we need to, in order to make change, we are stepping into the unknown in a certain degree, or to a certain degree. And many of us have an aversion to the unknown. We have an anxiety around it, a fear regarding the unknown, and sometimes excitement, but sometimes just out and out fear. And that's because this chaos in varying degrees emerges as we make change. We see this even when cleaning, right? Or decluttering, that oftentimes things get messy in the process of cleaning. We pull things away from the walls, we pick things up, rearrange things. So there's a sense of chaos that is part of that new order, so to speak. And as I said, there are degrees of this chaos, but the disruption, in order to make change, disruption is essential. Disruption is the pathway to change, because we have an established pattern, we have an established situation, and in order to bring about change, we need to disrupt that situation, right? That's the definition. And then what happens is in the course of that disruption, as we're moving into that change, then a new baseline occurs. So this happens emotionally too, as we progress in our emotional growth. We go through similar process where we have adapted to the way things are. We have our way of being. And then as we're moving into growth or trying to grow beyond certain things, it means digging up some of the pain points, digging up challenges or traumas in some way or another, emotions even that may have been dormant for a while, and things can become chaotic in the process, and until the dust settles, so to speak, back to the cleaning metaphor. And when the dust settles, things are often, it's kind of like rearranging the furniture. Things are different. And so it's important to recognize that order to chaos kind of, and then chaos to order, that process is a natural process. It's an essential process. We can't accomplish change without it. And if we can recognize that that's normal, and what I'm speaking about particularly is with the disruption of emotions, and maybe moving through emotions in ways that feel somewhat chaotic. You know, 1 minute feeling fine, another minute feeling grief, another minute feeling anger, to be jumping all around in the process of change. It's not uncommon to be going through a range of emotions. And that can be really disruptive if we don't have the broader vantage point to recognize that this is part of a process. That if we get drawn into the stories about those emotions, that's often what happens, is we experience emotions and then look at, well, why am I feeling that way? And then concoct a whole story about it. We can also generate emotions through the stories that we've created as well. But what I'm talking about here is the emotional cacophony that can happen, the discordance, the frenetic movement from one emotion to another emotion, to be bouncing all over the place. What happens is we often, in the experience of that, question our sanity. Like, what's wrong with me? What's going on? Am I crazy to be feeling all these feelings and to be bouncing all over the place like this? And the thing is that it is part of a process of finding our feet again. And we were talking about depression the other day and sensory awareness, and how important sensory awareness was to keep us connected and to keep us from falling more deeply into the darkness of depression. And when we can allow ourselves in this process of change to reinforce our connections with ourselves, with others, that can help us through. And really what happens a lot of times is, in the process of change, we retreat, we we limit our external input so that we can deal with whatever it is we're trying to deal with, which is the same process that they saw the brain going through in depression, is just limiting the input from the externalities, and then focusing on trying to sort out whatever this change is, whether it's conscious or other than unconscious, other than conscious. And so when we have the capability to bring that process to our conscious awareness, when we can elevate it to our conscious awareness, there's a very different experience. We then have an opportunity to choose. In other words, we have the opportunity to choose not to get swept up in the story of the emotion. And we can recognize that what we're going through is a normal, although very uncomfortable often, but is a normal process of change. And I remember years ago, I went to a certification program, an intensive with Tony Robbins. And one of the things that he says or said is, if you're confused, it means you're going to learn something. And when we think about the process of learning, again, what's happening? There's a disruption of typically of existing information, right? There's a challenge to existing information showing us, oh, there's something here, at the very least, something here I don't know, or maybe something contradictory to what I thought I knew. And then we go through an evaluation process, and it can feel sometimes like dominoes, where one thing affects another, affects another, affects another. And eventually we get to the other side of it. Hopefully, most of us. And we do that by processing through the thoughts, the emotions, the experiences. And if we can do that in a conscious way, if we can be aware of it and then give ourselves latitude, give ourselves the emotional latitude to say, okay, it's rough, rocky road right now, and that's temporary. If we can recognize that and allow ourselves not to resist it, but rather to roll with it and breathe our way through it, and maybe just notice with curiosity and compassion as we move through it, then that change can have more grace to it. But oftentimes change occurs in fits and starts, right? Because we get really uncomfortable with the unknown, and we resist it because we think it should be a different way. And then that just acts as an impediment to our progress. So really interesting. In working with a client who's doing brilliant work in repatterning themselves through a practice, patterning themselves into a more elevated state of being, from a place of deep anxiety to ultimately a place of joyful playfulness in life. They're experiencing more and more elevated, joyful state. But the contrast from this extreme anxiety to this sort of blissful joy is really, really radical. And they're, interestingly, they have noticed themselves beating themselves up for not being able to achieve this joyful state with a greater consistency. And rather than lauding themselves for achieving that joyful state when they do, what they're doing is focusing on when they're not there. And that's creating and perpetuating the state they're trying to transition out of. So this is an interesting sort of irony or contradiction there. But old patterns sometimes die hard. Not always, but sometimes. And there's comfort in the familiar, even when it's uncomfortable. So I have a client who used to talk about their favorite miserable, that was the go-to place. And the idea here is ultimately to change the baseline, to elevate the baseline, right? And this person has done that and is continuing to do that in a quite remarkable, laudable way. And I think that the speed at which we're able to do something like that has a lot to do with our tolerance for chaos. Because as we change, there is typically a part of ourselves that resists that change. There's typically a part of ourselves that really, really wants to maintain the order, the status quo, the familiar. And we might even engage in self-sabotage to be able to preserve that order, to preserve that status quo. So it's important and very helpful to be able to be aware, so that we can be alert to the possibility of those patterns emerging, and we can dance with them in a conscious way rather than being at the effect of them. So it's interesting. I was just thinking about how my environment often reflects my state. That as I go through periods of change, things become more chaotic in my environment. And then as I move through that and I find a little bit more solidity, then I'm able to create more order. I know it works differently for some other people. When they feel really chaotic, then they create order, or they clean. That, because cleaning is a way, or creating order in our environment is a way that we can exercise control, or at least the illusion of control in our environments. So that can be an interesting exercise for us to recognize what are our behavioral patterns that are indicators of our emotional state. This is all about, and we talked about this when we were talking about depression and connecting with our senses. This is all about finding the wisdom that's all around us. We have ways of communicating with ourselves and with nature that we might not be consciously aware of. One of those ways is through intuition, another is through bodily sensation, another is by observing our environment and what is happening in our environment. I mean, there are people who have their environment under tight control. It has to be just so all the time, and that gives them that sense of order. But when there's change, that order gets disrupted. You know, let's move around the furniture. Well, that creates disruption in order to do that, and that disruption can be so disrupting that it can throw us into emotional chaos as well. So, and yet change can be a wonderfully good thing, right? And the fact is that I think the only constant is change. And we can resist it by trying to keep everything ordered, and try to impose, well, things should be this way or that way or the other way. When we try to impose that on things that are changing, it doesn't really work so well. And I guess ultimately what we're talking about is learning to dance with the unknown, learning to dance with chaos, learning to dance with change, and finding maybe a richer sense of internalized order, which is internal alignment, internal centeredness, that when we have that North Star, we can weather change. We can, because there is a constancy about that. And it's not by an identity that we necessarily can define. That internal centeredness is not necessarily unchangeable, and yet it's constant. There is a place within us that we can touch, that we can connect to, that has some constancy about it. And it's beyond the personality. It's an constancy of essence. And the more connected we can be to that, the more we can dance with the chaos around us. And even our own emotional chaos, because it transcends that. And so in being able to cultivate our resiliency and our capacity for change, one of the most reassuring, maybe one of the most comforting, one of the most powerful ways to move through those, to move into life, not through life, but into life, is when we find that centeredness within ourselves. So I guess that's what we get to cultivate. And the question is, what does it take to do that? So as an example, this person was telling me that when they chant a certain mantra, when they chant, that brings them peace and joy. And so I suggested, well, why not chant then? Why not chant when you're doing this or you're doing that, or before you're doing this or that. And that was a revelation, like, why not? Why not give ourselves the gift of the practices that are going to deepen our connection so that we're better able to really engage in the dance of life? So that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to like, follow, and share Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the chat, and I'm in the description rather. And as always, it's a tremendous delight to have the honor and privilege of spending these mornings together. I'm so grateful. And until next time.